Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's meeting of the Policy and Performance Scrutiny Panel, which is being broadcast and recorded via Microsoft Teams Live. My name's Councillor Richard Goma. I'm the chair of the committee and I'll be conducting the meeting tonight. During the meeting, you'll hear from members of the committee who are shown on your screens now. Also present are officers from Eastleigh Borough Council who will present reports that have been written and who will provide support to the committee tonight. If we experience a connection problem, this event will be paused. If a councillor loses connection or joins later, we'll ask them to introduce or reintroduce themselves as appropriate. And in the unlikely event that I lose my connection, Councillor Cross, the Vice Chair, will take over. The first item on our agenda tonight is apologies, and I've received apologies from Councillor Dogway. I don't know if we have any other apologies.
No, Chair, that's it.
Thank you, Laura. Item 2 then is declarations of interest. Members, if you have declarations of interest that you wish to make, please indicate in the meeting chat. It doesn't look like there's any declarations of interest. Members, if you wish to state any later, you of course can do so. And item 3 would usually be public participation, but there is no public participation on this occasion, which brings me straight to my chair's report. Obviously, it hasn't been very long since our last meeting, so I don't have very much to update you on. Members of the committee, you will recall I sent round a link to sign up for standing portfolio groups, and some of you very valiantly tried but were overcome by IT troubles. IT have kindly changed a setting, so I'm going to send you round a new link for that sometime after this meeting, and I'd be grateful if you could take a minute or two just to take a look at that so that we can get those portfolio scrutiny groups arranged. That was all I had to add on that, which means we can get swiftly on with item 5, the general fund revenue budget 21-22 and performance monitoring to December 2020, and I'll ask Chief Financial Officer Sarah King to introduce that item for us.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, well, as you can imagine, it's been an absolutely unprecedented year where we've been dealing with the impact and fallout of the COVID pandemic. So all thanks to the staff and the finance team for trying to pull everything together. I've got a short presentation that I'll try and share with you now, just to talk you through the salient points of the budget. If you could let me know when you can see that coming up on your screens.
Yes, we can, thank you.
Fantastic. Yes. Thank you. So yes, so the year's had a massive impact on services and understandably on all the staff and councillors, and also clearly on the council's finances. So I think probably the best place to start is if I reassure councillors that the financial situation is stable into the medium term, and that is an excellent position to be in and quite enviable to some authorities if you look around the country. I'll just go through the slides now to give a bit more detail, flesh out some of the key points that you've seen in the budget report. So this year, rather than build a revised budget for approval as we normally do, the emphasis has been on forecasting all the expenditure and income in this ever-changing environment that we're in. So the report that you have before you looks to set a balanced budget for 2021-22 alongside a medium-term financial plan that takes us through to 25-26, and obviously the further out you go, the more estimated those figures are. So in setting the budget, as ever, we review each service in line with all the service managers, and we look at all the performance for the year to date alongside known emerging issues so that we can estimate the costs and incomes to build the budget up. And that process allows us to identify growth pressures and also efficiencies in the budget. This year, obviously, it's been extremely challenging because of the pandemic, and you're going to see that financial impact right throughout all of the estimates. But despite the challenges, service managers have still managed to deliver some efficiencies and managed to deliver most services. And they've all been mindful, I think, of the financial impact of any decision they're making when it's such a difficult economic climate. Alongside the assessment of the service budgets, we also look at the external funding, so the things we can't control as easily. So that's the income from business rates, from government grants and from council taxpayers. This slide summarises the assumptions that underpin the construction of the budget. So we've estimated the COVID-19 impacts, and then going forward through the medium-term financial plan, you'll see those reducing as we think services will come back online and footfall through the town centre and through the car parks will increase, those sorts of things. We've built in pay award inflation at 1% for each year. We cap general inflation at 0%, which is, we've done that for many years now, which is just to keep a cap on expenditure, unless it's contractual inflation, in which case we build that in. Fees and charges income, you may have seen come through local area committees and also to Cabinet a month or two ago, and we've tried to ask for a yield of 2%, which doesn't mean you put your charge up by 2%, it means you try to increase your yield. That's been particularly difficult, as you can imagine, so it's estimates because we have the impact of loss of income in many of our services. Interest rates, we build in based on advice from Arling Close, our advisors, our Treasury advisors, on what they think the interest rate impact will be. Currently the interest rate is extremely low, as you know, at 0.1%, which is almost free, but we do expect it to increase over time, and we prudently estimate that into the budget. We also have a reserve, you'll see later, in case it rises higher than we anticipate. Council tax, we have honoured the commitment, which is 1% below inflation at December. So that's the increase of council tax. Now inflation at December was actually 0.6%, which means that council tax is actually going to decrease by 0.4%. And overriding all of that, we need to maintain our general fund reserve at £1 million, which we have done throughout the life of the medium-term financial plan. So this table is just a few numbers, which shows you that for this year, 2021, and for next, there is a balanced budget. Net revenue spend will be approximately £10 million. Each year there'll be a small draw from the general fund reserve, and the reserve is maintained at £1 million as per policy. As I've already said, funding from council tax will be set at the agreed policy, 1% below inflation, which means a decrease for council taxpayers. So the average Band D property charge is £129.38 next year if this is approved, compared to £129.91 in the year before, so a small decrease. It's worth noting, and we've said this for a few years and the government keep putting it off, and this time I think it's been delayed because of the pandemic and the uncertainty, but business rates, which for us generate about £4 million a year for the council, they're likely to be reset by central government in 22-23, and that means that the impact of business rates across the whole country is evened out, and as currently we're a growth area, that growth is likely to be taken away from us, which could see us lose up to about £1.5 million each year. That has been built into our budget assumptions, but it's just another pressure for us to look at. And on the positive side, this year and a little bit for next year, there have been one-off COVID grants from central government to help us over this difficult time. So if we look at the COVID-19 impacts, they've been huge, but this is just some of the areas. So obviously it affected both costs and income. So we've had additional costs through things such as we've had to ramp up health and safety massively. We've had to spend money making town centres safe. We've put money aside for additional bad debt provisions. We've had additional health enforcement. So there's lots of things we've had to spend out on to make that to get us through this year. And obviously that is compounded by lost income. So income, as you'd expect, and I'm sure you're well aware and you've seen it, with so few people out and about to be safe. Areas such as car parking with the impact of lockdowns, closures at the Point in the Berry, reduced trade waste service, reductions in rental income at places like Eastleigh Business Centre, and reductions in some rental agreements where people have had CVAs agreed, have all seen a loss of income for us. So the forecast impacts of that pandemic, we've obviously reflected them right through the medium-term financial plan into future years, and we anticipate a slow recovery to previous levels. At the bottom of that slide, you can see that we have received some specific grants from central government. So the specific grants are for things such as the recovery of the town centre and the community. We've had general grant of nearly £4 million towards losses that we've incurred and costs. And also we've been able to claim for losses of fees and charges. So that's about 2 million this year, but that, although we're claiming it, we have yet to be confirmed by government that we can claim it all, but that scheme's been extended into next year as well. So we're looking to claim another about £800,000 from that year too. Now the reserves is important. I've said about maintaining the general fund reserve at £1 million, and that represents the funding for unforeseen emergencies. Also, alongside that, there are things where we set aside money to cover potential financial risks, and we set those aside in earmarked reserves. Total reserves, we're going to forecast those to be about 23 million by the end of next year. A significant proportion, which is quite important, I think, relates to reserves set up prudently to cover unexpected increases in interest rates, as I mentioned before, and also we've got over £4 million for unexpected voids within the property portfolio, and that's alongside the bad debt provision that we already have set aside. As you're well aware, council's a net borrower, and with forecast net borrowing at the end of next year of nearly £600 million. So obviously one of our pressures is interest rates, and to mitigate the risk of interest rates fluctuating, about 60% of our borrowing is a fixed rate, so we're protected and we know exactly what we're going to pay every year on that element. It's important to note that the borrowing is predominantly linked to income generating assets or projects. So 44% of that borrowing, which is about 260 million, relates to a commitment to income generating housing projects. And then there's also our property portfolio, which contributes a net surplus of £11 million to the revenue budget every year. So just to put it in context, if we didn't have that money coming from those areas, we didn't invest in those income generating schemes, we'd have to find money elsewhere if we put it on council tax, which we couldn't, because obviously it would be too large an increase, but it would mean an additional £200 per year per council taxpayer. So I think that covers the main points in the budget report that's in front of you this evening. I've tried to pull out the salient bits. In summary, I think, in my opinion, the council's in a sound short to medium term financial position. That's based on known and forecast issues that we've got in front of us. But we do need to remember that we're still in the reactionary phase of COVID-19. And as we don't know with certainty when we're going to move into the recovery phase, so this is very much a moving feast, and we will be revising that medium-term financial plan all the time. And if things crop up, then we will be reporting it back to councillors. I think it's important that we apply our resources in line with our corporate plan to make sure we get the right results, but we need to very much continue controlling costs with an emphasis on efficiency and income generation to make sure we can keep into that safe medium-term financial plan. I think that covers all my main points, Chair. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Sarah. We'll start with any questions from non-committee members. Could you indicate in chat if you wish to ask a question? Councillor Atkinson.
Thank you, Chair. I just have one question for Sarah, if I may. She said that I think that the council tax precept was going to go down by 0.4%, but the figures actually show an increase in precept receipts. Can you please expand on that?
Yes, I could talk you through that. So it very much depends whether you're talking a special expense. I'm not sure exactly which paragraph you're speaking of in the budget report, but the average band D council tax will be going down by 0.4%. The council tax base has gone up, so that will see our income from council tax go up just because of more houses. So the base that we calculate the amount on goes up each year. Does that cover it?
Just the point I wanted to understand. How much has the council base gone up by, please?
Oh, off the top of my head, I can't tell you, to be honest. That's the detail, but I can get it and come back to you with that information. About 700, I think I'm told.
If you could get me those figures, that'd be great.
Yeah, I'll get you the detail. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chairman. Thank
you. Any more non-committee members want to speak? I've got no one asking in chat. So let's move on. Committee members, would anyone like to ask a question or speak? Could you indicate in chat, please? Councillor Tyson-Payne.
I think all I want to say is this looks very good. It feels comfortable. I've been through it. To be honest, sometimes the figures don't make 100% sense to me because that's not my area of expertise. However, it looks good, it looks sound, and fingers crossed that's the way it goes. I was interested though what rate we had at fixed rate borrowing, or are they all very slightly different? Each package is a different rate.
They're slightly different. There's about 4 different fixes, so they are average about 1.9%. And bearing in mind the short-term rate is 0.1, so hence why we've got a split between the long-term and the short-term, because some of it's very much worth having some short-term interest rate, but yeah, average is about 1.9%.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Well done, everyone.
Thank you. Councillor Tidridge.
Thank you. I'm sure this is being done, but I need to ask the question. There is a lot of stuff obviously within the budget in terms of the response to COVID. I think we're likely to see some very significant changes in behaviour longer term. I, for example, can't imagine being in a position where I go to an office every day anymore. I really think that's going to be a long-term change. I can't imagine going to just walk around the shops in the way I might have done in the past. And again, that's something which that may recover a little bit more. But I really do think there are some big changes in the world of work, the world of retail. Are we, and I'm sure we are, waking up those kind of different scenarios in terms of if office demand crashes, what's the impact in terms of rentals? If retail demand crashes long term, what's the impact in terms of income for the council? Thank you.
Yes, you're right. We are looking at all of those things, and we thought we would be into that recovery phase sooner than we are. I think the third lockdown's hit all of us. So we're looking very much at the impact of all of those things. Pleased to say that we have quite a spread in our property portfolio, and it's quite a flexible portfolio for use. So we've built in as much as we can, and we do have that property reserve in the background. But I think you're right. I think it's how are the town centres going to recover? What are we going to do to bring those back? And all that work, both with the community and also with the council itself, on how we return to work and on what basis. I think that will shape everything. So all of that work is being done in the background and all the modelling, but we don't know the answer yet, so we don't know quite which bit to launch.
Thank you.
Thank you. And next is Councillor Dogood, please.
Thank you. Yeah, brilliant presentation, I thought. Excellent, and very well done by the team. I had 2 queries really. One was also relating to borrowing and the fixed rate borrowing. Roughly on average, what is the duration of the fixed rate period? Is it something like 8 years or 10 years or whatever? And the other question related to the bad debt provision. Quite often in businesses you have different categories of bad debt, some which is utterly, totally irretrievable, no chance at all of recovering any of it, and then quite often a couple of other categories of debt which it's improbable to collect but was still worth pursuing. So I would be grateful for some comments on those 2 areas, please.
Yeah, so our fixed debt, we have a bit at 10, a bit at 25 years and quite a chunk at 50, so there's a bit of a spread over time. So that covers your long-term debt question. As for the bad debt provision, you're right, but we go through every debt, so we don't do an average based on this how much debt we have and we'll provide a percentage. We actually look at every debt, but then we provide it based on 50% if we think it's quite recoverable, or we will provide 100% if we think it's more risky debt. And then we review all of that every year. I couldn't give you the percentage off the top of my head of how much we do at 50 and how much we do at 100, but yeah, that's how we do it. But we do look at every individual debt.
Excellent. Sounds very logical. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I've got no one else asking in chat, and members, if you want to ask questions, do indicate. I have a few questions myself. The comparison to what was budgeted shows an unfavourable variance on efficiencies. I know we've been to some extent off track on those, I think, for a little while. Are those efficiencies, in your view, still achievable, or do we need to re-benchmark what's viable?
Yeah, I think what we did, we were planning to set up a whole raft of efficiency measures and drive them through, and then COVID hit, and it is just not the time to put the pressures on in that way. So we've managed to still have a balanced budget and buy ourselves a little bit of time. So what we're going to wait for now is the recovery. When the recovery starts to come back, that's when we'll ramp up our efficiencies again, and we'll come with a whole new continuous improvement package to councillors to approve, to say this is where we're going to focus our efforts. Because as Councillor Tidridge said, we don't quite know how it's all going to come back, and that's where we'll focus our energies.
Thank you. And then the medium-term financial plan predicts sort of increasing withdrawals from reserves in 22-23 onwards. Is that because we've taken a sort of pessimistic view, or is that because of some underlying reason to start withdrawing from them?
No, we try to be as prudent as possible. You could call it pessimistic. We try to build everything in that we can, and then have the comfort that we still have that buffer in there. So as time goes on, if the interest rate stays low, we'll need less in the interest reserve, so we can pull more out of there. So yeah, so it's a balance of all of it. But if you look through, you'll see it's quite a prudent budget. So we should be quite comfortable and should be able to weather the storm.
Thank you. And then one more, and we've talked about COVID and recovery, and I think it's pretty true that that sort of acute COVID impact will probably reduce. But in terms of secondary impacts like a recession, it feels like potentially they remain a little longer. Is that potential economic slowdown included in our forecasts?
Yes, we build all of that in. So we look at every individual service to see the impact, and also the Treasury picture to look at what happens with the interest rate, and that's why we use our Treasury advisors. So we're definitely looking longer term, and we're looking at a slow recovery and then what will happen. Yeah, so we've built all that in. As far as we know, I mean, clearly these estimates won't be right because something will change, but based on best estimates, yeah.
Thank you. I actually found another question on another sheet of paper. The medium-term financial plan projects council tax to increase by quite reasonable amounts. Is that presumably a result of housing growth? How's that mitigated if, for instance, schemes don't progress due to a downturn?
Well, we base it on the estimates in the local plan, and to date we've been quite accurate in getting it right. Council tax is only one of our income levels, so if that were to drop off, I wouldn't expect it to be that much. I mean, we're looking at an increase this year of about 700 properties, so if it was half of that, it's not that big an impact on our budget, so we would be able to bear that.
Brilliant, thank you. I've got no one else asking to speak in chat, in which case I'm content that we note that we've looked at the budget and go on to the next item. Thank you for that presentation. So item 6 is the housing revenue account, and I'm going to ask Head of Finance Andy Smith to introduce that item, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'll take it based on the report as read, but I wanted to give members a bit of background in terms of what housing revenue account is and why we're doing it. This is very much the next step on EC's housing journey. So as you will have been aware, we've done a lot of work already around market rental, market sale properties and rent to own products. We are now looking to take the next step in terms of affordable delivery and direct delivery by ourselves. That's very much working in partnership with current existing registered providers such as Vivid and Abri, which will be used already in the market, and this will help us deliver more of our own aims and objectives for affordable and possibly push the boundaries around what we can achieve more so than the more private sector areas do. But this report specifically today is seeking approval to open our housing revenue account, and the housing revenue account is where we account for the rental and the costs of affordable housing properties. They don't sit within the general fund of the council, and the funds are specifically ring-fenced within the housing revenue account and can only be used and recycled within that pot of money. So you can only, any profits you generate can only be used to create more affordable benefit. They can't be used to subsidise services. You can put general fund money into the housing revenue account, but you can't take it out. And that's the purpose of this report. Now, those of you, there'll possibly be a few of you here today that were around. We did used to have one many years ago, and hence the reason why we have to seek approval to reopen. It's simply writing to Secretary of State, seek approval to reopen. You'll get approval to do it. We already have all of the legal powers, all the statutory powers in place. Every local authority already has that. We just simply need to get approval to recognise we can reopen. I think it's important for committee members to note here, whilst this report is reopening the housing revenue account, it isn't seeking the approval for the spend within it yet. That will be the next step of the report. There's a lot of statutory accounting we need to do within it. The very first step will be a full a minimum 35-year business plan that shows that the housing revenue account would be sustainable and not cause a loss, and we can provide the aims and objectives that we wish. So that will be the next step of our journey once we've got approval to reopen. And it's clear, and it needs to be, I think it's very sort of useful for members to keep that in mind. By opening this, we aren't committing at this stage to spend anything within it, and it doesn't impact our current housing programme. Hopefully that gives members a bit of a feel for the purpose of what this element of the report is for. And if I hand back to you, Chair, for questions.
Thank you, Andy. Do I have any questions from non-committee members? Could you indicate in chat, please? I'll give you a few seconds in case you try and find the chat button. Otherwise, any committee members who have questions or comments, could you indicate in chat? Nothing yet. I'll start with one of my own questions. The Savills report concludes that the HRA option provides, and I quote, some protection from right to buy into the medium term, though I couldn't see the reasoning for that conclusion, nor is it discussed in the report. I just wondered what analysis had been conducted of sort of how many right to buy purchases we could expect, what the risk would be sort of from year 15 onwards on those properties, and how the viability of the scheme and the level of our council house provision be maintained.
Okay, it's a good question. So right to buy, historically with the HRAs, right to buy was a big problem in terms of extracting property value from within it. There are now new provisions within the right to buy rules. So how it works, a tenant has to be in the house for a number of years, roughly 6 to 8 years to build up the full opportunity of the benefit. And it doesn't have to be the same house, to be fair. It has to be a house within the housing revenue account, but it doesn't have to be the same property. At that point, they then have the right to buy the property. And that is an agreed discounted rate from the market. What happens now, however, the new legislation has changed. So when you put a house in, you declare the cost price of that property, and the right to buy discount cannot go below that. Mm-hmm. So at any point, should the house be purchased out of the HRA now, you can recycle the funds and replace the dwelling almost immediately. The funds are back in. So it's unlikely. Somewhere like Fareham, for example, has approximately 2,500. They've said, I can't remember the figure they quoted how many they sell, but the impact is very limited, and they allow the provision for approximately 2 to 3 a year in terms of right to buy. So you can see it's not a huge scale, and something that particularly now the funding is more effective, is very easy to replace and keep the stock levels high.
Great, thank you. Councillor Broadhurst has a question.
Sorry about that, my computer's a bit slow to react. Right, as one of the miserable ones who can actually remember when we had a council housing before, one of the problems that we used to have with, and we had a council housing, was that the whole cost of the housing had to come out of the housing revenue budget. We couldn't subsidise it from outside. Then there were two problems. One, the government in benefits didn't pay us back the whole cost of the rent. So there was a shortfall which had to be made up by the other tenants. So those tenants who were in work, their rent increased out of proportion because it had to make up for the losses we were getting in losses of benefit. Originally, this wasn't too much of a problem, but as more and more of the houses were sold, it meant that because they were sold to a lot of the people who could afford to buy them, so that therefore the cost to those who were in work became disproportionate in the ratio of increases. Now, do I take it that the law has changed so that we wouldn't get ourselves back into that position again, where those who are living in a council property and who are working can afford are having to pay more to subsidise those who are on benefit? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So there's a couple of points there. So first of all, in terms of the funding, you're very much correct. So historically, funding the housing revenue account was a big problem, as the funds could only be put in from very finite places. That's now unring fenced, so you can now borrow direct into the HRA. You can also use external grant. Homes England, for example, have a lot of grants available that we could use eventually for those, or like I've said, you can use funding within your normal general fund account. So the funding issues very much moved away, as has the rent rules. So the rents are now very much regulated and limited to certain levels, and every property has to be within that same range. So there is no cross subsidy depending on who can afford to pay more. Everyone will pay the same rent levels, and regardless, they're deemed in there to be in their own merit, and there won't be people penalised because they could happen to pay more.
Thank you very much for that. That sounds like a very good idea then, and a good scheme. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. I have some more questions. I understand we've currently got around 150 units currently held on behalf of the council in some external arrangements. Would they be transferred into the HRA, or would they remain as they are?
So those will remain as they are because they're currently market rental property. So it's the big distinction. You can hold other types of property within an HRA should we wish to, but you can't hold housing in there that you want to charge at a market rent. So the external vehicles around our aspect structure will remain the same for our market rental properties, and the affordable properties will sit in the HRA. So any we currently own will not transfer in unless we opt to make them affordable rent.
Right, thank you. And then, although the HRA would be ring fenced from the general fund, you did note that money can be put in, and presumably there are situations in which the council could incur a liability for costs beyond what's available in the HRA. So for instance, if we'd opened an account several years ago and we built some buildings with some lovely aluminium cladding, we'd potentially be facing a large cost to now rectify that. Presumably, the cost containment is different in that HRA model than it would be in, say, a separate company, but that could, in a worst case scenario, if we were to allow it, go bankrupt in its own right. Is that the case, and how will those additional risks be managed?
Yeah, so it is the case that in theory, if you didn't have a prudent business plan, like you say, the HRA effectively could go bankrupt for that equivalent. If there was an unforeseen problem like that, you could use the revenue funds, borrow from revenue into the HRA and repay it. But the way the business planning works is very much around significant maintenance reserve. Effectively, there's lots of mechanisms around debt repayment and such, but the benefit really focuses on long-term planning of repairs and renewals. So at that point, they are phased in and made sure that programmed repairs can be undertaken. You're right, it doesn't necessarily exclude, certainly in the early years, probably it wouldn't exclude if it was an immediate change in regulation, that would be a problem, which we could look to use our other maintenance, general fund maintenance reserves, loan them into the HRA and pay them back. But so that we would get round it that way if it was done only in the very early years. I think you'd have to have roughly from what we've seen on models, you'd have to have a very significant problem in the first sort of 5 to 6 years of your HRA for that to be a problem.
Thank you for that. That sounds okay to me. I've got no one else asking to give any questions or comments, in which case I think we can take that report as read. And thank you for coming to talk to us about it.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Which takes us on to item 7, planning enforcement performance. I'm going to ask Head of Housing and Development Andy Granfield to introduce that item for us.
Thank you, Chair. You'll recall that we attended a committee meeting in both October 2019 and January 2020 to talk about the planning enforcement. It was primarily to talk about the launch of the planning enforcement strategy, which set out a commitment from the council about how they would approach enforcement, which is a discretionary service, but I think it's very important to set down some criteria and some thresholds because enforcement does underpin the credibility of the planning system. So we see that as a very, very important service that we offer. We've also been, as part of that, doing some performance monitoring, which has been rolling on for a few years now. So it's quite good to be able to look back a year later just to see where we've got to from when we met with you 12 or 13 months ago. I think overall it's encouraging to see an improvement in performance, and that's against a backdrop of an increase in reported numbers. We've got virtually the same number of cases reported so far this year as we had for the entire period of last year. And we've seen our overall performance, both in terms of site visits and closing of cases, increased as well. So workload's gone up and performance has increased. So that was a really positive sign coming out of it. I think there were a few areas which, as a committee, you particularly asked us to look into, and certainly some of the comments that you made. One was around making sure we had appropriate resources within the organisation to undertake the enforcement service as we would want to see. At that stage, I reported we were recruiting a new enforcement officer to take us from 2 to 3 officers. We did recruit at the beginning of April, and so we were at 3 officers for a period of time. Unfortunately, that officer left in December, so we've dropped back down to 2 planning enforcement officers, but we have got an advert out at the moment and are hopeful that we can recruit and reappoint relatively quickly. I think the interviews are in about 2 weeks' time for that. You will recall that enforcement responsibilities are split across not only the enforcement team but also the localities team, and they look at the lower priority cases, which numerically are the higher number, and they are certainly well resourced as well to meet their needs. And obviously, to ensure that we've got a robust enforcement service, we need to work closely with our legal team, and we now have regular bi-monthly meetings with them to ensure that any enforcement action or prosecutions are moved forward as quickly as they can be. And I've had confirmation that they also are sufficiently resourced to meet the expectations. So overall, I think both in terms of performance and resourcing, we're doing well. We also looked at sort of the robustness of enforcement, and I think robustness can be measured in various ways. It's not all about the number of enforcement notices that are served, but actually how quickly we can do things as well, because most enforcement cases are resolved through negotiation or ceasing of the breach of planning in the first place. We have continued to issue enforcement notices throughout this year. However, as you've heard with other presentations tonight, COVID and the implications in terms of lockdown and the people's ability to comply with some of the enforcement notices has meant we've been a bit more lenient and sympathetic to people's positions. And we've either granted an extension of time to comply with enforcement notices, or we've not issued enforcement notices, particularly during the heavy periods of lockdown. But we have, behind the scenes, kept the wheels turning so that as soon as we can issue an enforcement notice, we do issue them. We are still registering cases, hence the reason the numbers are high. So we're confident that in terms of robustness, we're still meeting expectations. Now, enforcement's not just about reactive and responding to the problems that are presented to us, but also monitoring sites and ensuring that condition schemes particularly are checked up on. And I'm pleased again to say that, as you'll see at the bottom of the report in the conclusion, we've had an increase in the number of proactive condition monitoring cases this year compared to previous years. That will go up further once we're back to fully resourced again, but please, just because we haven't been necessarily proactively monitoring them from an enforcement point of view, that doesn't mean as a local planning authority we're not watching these sites, because actually that responsibility does fall to the planning officers who are looking at the conditions themselves. So there are officers involved, just not necessarily the enforcement officer. So it's a statistic which isn't captured. And finally, I think the comment that came out from the committee was about formalising communication and improving how we communicate both our successes and updates on schemes to all our customers. I've already mentioned the improved communication with the legal team. We are sending out quarterly and annual reports on performance. And I know Phil Wiseman, who's on the call tonight as a senior enforcement officer, sends out on a weekly basis and a monthly basis performance updates as well to all councillors and parish council. We're not able to go out to everybody involved in every case on a monthly basis, but certainly the higher priority cases, we are keeping people informed. So I think, to conclude, overall, there has been an improvement in service. We're doing what we've set out to do. We realise there are still improvements and we're not hitting all our targets all of the time, but it's certainly heading in the right direction. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Andy. I concur, the picture looks quite good, and thank you for running through how you've responded to those recommendations that we made last time. Members, if you have questions or comments, could you indicate in chat, please? Councillor Tidridge.
Thank you, Andy, for the update. I've got a couple of questions. Firstly, looking at paragraph 18, interesting to see the comments being made on proactive actions on conditions. But what I'm particularly interested in, I think this goes back to what you're saying about is going beyond the numbers. Would it be possible to add a section to the report where we look specifically at planning enforcement with regards to community benefit? So items of community benefit, how that's happened with planning enforcement. You'll be very aware of the issues that I've been getting very grumpy about at the Chase near me. 2 years, I think, since the last house was sold, and yet the allotments and cemeteries have still not been handed over to the borough council, let alone the parish council. There's been other issues as well locally. Councillor Cowdery, I'm sure, will be able to give you a very long list of things relating to the Crowd Hill development. So I think it would be really nice to see a section in this report specifically looking at planning enforcement with regards to items of community benefit. I'm not saying that other issues aren't less important, but certainly in terms of what fills my inbox from local residents, it's the items of community benefit that seem to cause the most aggravation. The second thing I'd like to ask about is something which, again, I think Councillor Cowdery has mentioned as well as myself, which is looking at the kind of lessons learnt side of things. It would be great if every time a development takes place, there is a session afterwards where planning enforcement are able to feed back to planning, to legal, etc., and just try and make sure we get things set up right in the first place. If we're having complaints and issues, I mean, there's a great example on Bishopstoke Park near me, where there's a stretch of land that really should have been a footpath, a permissive footpath, and that was done in such a way that we're now having to look at compulsory purchasing potentially that piece of land to be able to get the planning condition to happen. That could have maybe been avoided with a little bit of more joined up thinking at the start of the planning process. So really making sure that we're getting the feedback from planning enforcement, feeding into planning, feeding into new developments. I just really like to get to the point where local residents see a development go up and their hearts sink because they know that the promises won't be kept in terms of community benefit, or certainly not within a timely manner. And they know there's going to be all sorts of problems. They know it's not going to be nice to be able to live with, and anything we can do to ease that aggravation for residents would be fantastic. You never know, they might even feel more positive about development if they had a more positive experience of it. Thank you.
Chair, would you like me to come back on a couple of those points?
Yes, please do.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, there's some good points there, Councillor Tidridge, and I'm familiar with the sites and the issues that you've mentioned. I think you're right, the community benefits are generally captured within the section 106s for planning applications, and that's a point which isn't explicitly mentioned within the report we've got here, and we could look at that for future reference. I think what's encouraging is that probably the whole dimension of planning has shifted to infrastructure first. And whereas often with some of the older Section 106 agreements, and certainly the sites that you and I have been involved with recently, those are sort of 3, 4, 5 years old, those applications where infrastructure was seen coming in after 50%, 70% of the development was built and occupied. And we are actually front loading that now, and we're getting a lot of the infrastructure in early, which obviously incentivises the developer to make sure they get it right and in a timely fashion. So not only does it deliver to the community, the new community coming into the site, but it also focuses the mind of the developer to make sure that they do what they say they're going to do. In terms of lessons learned, we're always learning on each site. There are problems which crop up which we don't always anticipate. Whilst we may not formally report that back, and we certainly don't do an audit of every site which we report back on, there is good communications within the team. The enforcement team work closely with the planning officers and the legal team, and so we are improving our processes all the time, but it's quite difficult to report back on exactly what those changes are, just making sure that they don't happen on a regular basis or get repeated. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Councillor Broadhurst, you have a question / comment.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, well, yeah, I agree that we have seen some improvements in the enforcement service, and I'm pleased to be able to say that. That is good. I will add to the sort of comments about transferring of ownership after things have been built. Hut Farm Place was a play area that was out of guarantee and ready to be transferred about 4 or 5 years ago. It still hasn't actually managed to be transferred to the parish council. That is a bit of a pain. But where I do feel there is still a slight problem, and I'm sure Andy or Phil will realise where I'm going to go with this, is where you've got derelict properties, which cause the neighbours a lot of upset. You have a garden which no one attends to, is really badly overgrown. Neighbours are convinced they're seeing rats running in and out. Houses which are boarded up, and when that's a semi-detached house or an end of terrace, it really does put a blight on the neighbours and makes it very difficult for them to sell their properties. And there are two in Chandlersford, Bodycoats Road and Bournemouth Road, which I see is actually mentioned in the report once as ongoing. So I understand the problems, but it does cause considerable frustration to members, because the two I'm thinking of have been going on not just for 1 or 2 years, but this has been now 5, 6, even more years that there have been problems as far as the neighbours are concerned, blighting the properties. And I do wish that we could speed up the process on that, because it is a problem for the neighbours.
If I could just take this one, if that's okay. I would like to say, with regards to the two properties in Chandlersford, they have been on the books for longer than what we would have liked to have hoped. Unfortunately, there's circumstances that are outside of our control, which we have no power over, and we have to wait for processes to follow through. 96 Bournemouth Road, we are looking to carry out the remaining direct action works within the next couple of months. Bodycoats Road is in the hands of another department at the moment, but we're still actively monitoring it. I share your frustration, and I appreciate the impact it has on the visual amenity and the character of the area. It's not something that we like to see, properties that are like that for a considerable amount of time, and we are working as hard as we can to get them back into habitable accommodation, whatever way that may be. So yeah, I share your frustration, but yeah, I'd just like to point out that sometimes quite often it's things that are outside of our control that can then make the cases longer than what we would have liked. But we don't want to close the case while things are ongoing, so we will keep that case open until such time that the property is suitably restored. Thank you.
My only comment to that is it would help if you communicated with the local members who are still getting flack from the neighbours. And and if someone comes to us and we can't give them an answer as to what the delay is about or why, it doesn't reflect well on the council. Thanks.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Again, we have a difficulty where we can't divulge too much information, but more than happy for my contact details to be given to residents that may contact you regarding these 2 properties. I know them very well, so I'm more than happy to speak to any residents that may wish to speak. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you, Phil. Councillor Grajewski.
Yes, thank you. Just a couple of comments. Some of these cases do take a long time, and I was very pleased actually with the way that Mr. Wiseman and the team conducted one Heatherdean Road in Chandler's Ford, and he used to give me an annual report, and sometimes I didn't even have to ask for it. It just came as if it was marked on his calendar, and it has now been resolved. It was something
Oh, I think we might have lost Councillor Grajewski there. We hope she comes back in a second. Oh. No, definitely something going on there. Let's hope she gets over those connection problems and can come back soon. I have a couple of questions of my own while that issue is resolved. I couldn't see in the October to December result sort of legal actions split out in terms of resolution. Are they included in the resolved category, or are they elsewhere? Was there just none?
If there's any resolutions, they will be in the report. So if there aren't any in there, there would be that there's none for that quarter. But if you've got any specific queries, I can look into that and come back to you.
Okay, thank you.
So could I come back, please? I got cut off.
Yes, we saw that. Yes, carry on.
I'm sorry, somebody put the microwave on, and yeah, the priority 4s are often what are very important to people. I remember speaking with Paul Naylor when we were talking about grass cutting and hedges and so on, and he said, you know, he really got the fact that to people who don't go out much, and what they see out of their window is what the most important thing in the borough to them. And so, you know, it's the priority 4 thing, isn't it? It might be priority 4 on the council's scheme, but for a lot of residents, it's their top priority. Thanks.
I think with that one, Councillor Grajewski, you're right. To us, it is deemed as a priority 4, but to them, it's the most important thing. So it's about managing the expectation. What we tried to set out from the very outset is what's going to happen throughout the investigation, give them timescales that we're looking to adhere to, and just keeping that communication involved. So it can range from a variety of different issues for priority 4, but if it's registered as a priority 4, there's no reason why it can't move throughout the investigation. So it could move up to a 3 or even a 2. So it's just about making sure that the complainant is kept fully updated, and the site is monitored as much as it needs to be. Thank you.
Thank you. One more from me. You mentioned the increase in cases sort of towards the end of last year. You can see that in the report. Is that a backlog coming through that you think have been unreported during the pandemic, or is that back to sort of normal level? And is that likely to sort of undo the positive work that's been done on clearing through them? So I suppose what effectively I'm asking is that increase likely to be sustained, and is that a sustainable workload for the resource that's in place?
Thank you. We have seen a sharp increase in the number of cases with the COVID situation. There's obviously people are at home and they're noticing things a lot more, and they're going out and about in their local area for the exercise and seeing things which may not have normally been reported. So we have seen the increase. Potentially that could fall, but also it could remain as is. I think we are registering everything that comes into us. So whether it's something historically that may have come through in the enforcement inbox, for example, that we're able to kind of deal with quite quickly, or maybe just a drive-by is needed and then it's kind of resolved. Historically, not all those kind of jobs would have been registered on the system. So those kind of things we're looking to capture to make sure that we've got an accurate picture of the workload that we've got. So I would anticipate the number of cases coming in on a weekly basis to continue kind of as they are. There's going to be peaks and troughs, but I think it's going to be quite steady throughout, depending on how this lockdown and the restrictions and the whole COVID situation pans out. We'll closely monitor it, but we're adequately resourced at this moment in time to deal with the current workload. Thank you.
Super, thank you. Councillor Asman.
Thank you, Chair. Slightly esoteric question. A lot of the casework I get seems to be, I'm trying to save you some work in a way, quite a lot of it really appears to be landlord and tenant conflicts. There are trees that need managing in the garden, the rubbish should have been taken, who repairs the fence and the fence is down and the rats are coming in and that sort of thing. Do you by any chance have a comprehensive list of landlords? Because a lot of these people, there seems to be a lot of illegal subletting going on and they don't really know who they paid. Well, I pay it to Joe and he pays it to whoever. Do you have a list of landlords, or do you know the well-known developments where possibly I can put them in touch to save it coming through you, where it's not fair if I refer something to enforcement and actually at the end of the day it's something that the landlord ought to be looking into?
It's not something that I've got an ongoing list of. Obviously, we deal a lot with the housing associations and things like that, so we have their contact details, but general landlord list is not something that we have. It's something definitely worth bearing in mind when we deal with people on a regular basis. But yeah, at this moment in time, I wouldn't have a list of landlords. But in the meantime, if you continue to send it through to us, we're more than happy to look at it. And if we've got any details where we can pass on landlord details, then obviously we will.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Asman. Any more comments or questions from anyone? No one asking in chat. What I propose then is we note the positive performance of planning enforcement and the engagement with the prior recommendations from the panel. And then there are a couple of issues that came up that we might want to make some minor recommendations around. One was picking up on Councillor Tidridge's point, but maybe we could get some detail on that, on the caseload that relates to the proactive monitoring of items related to community benefit. Maybe we could get a breakdown on those just to understand what's going on there. And that second, where have I written this? That we ensure that LAC and ward councillors have an opportunity to feed in and review the lessons learned on major developments. It sounds like that would be positive development for some members who've raised things there. So any questions or comments on those recommendations from anyone? A seconder would be nice, and Andy or Phil, if you have any comments on those are viable, they're welcome too. Thank you, Malcolm, for seconding. No one's asking to speak. Andy, please come back on those.
Sorry, I just threw that in at the very end there. Yeah, in terms of the monitoring of the community assets, something which just crossed my mind is, as of this year, we've started introducing a monitoring charge of Section 106s, which is a positive move, and it's a charge which is built into the Section 106 process, depending on the scale of development, which will help improve our entire Section 106 service. And that's something I know that my team and the finance team, working with the local area managers, are keen to see improved. And part of that will be sort of proactive monitoring of Section 106 agreements and ensuring that the trigger points within a development, once they're reached, we notice it rather than relying on a developer to contact us. So that's actually going to be quite an interesting one, which hopefully over the next year will help improve that deliverability of the community benefits. So it's not so much enforcement, but it's timely reminders being sent to developers that they've reached a certain threshold. And in terms of the lessons learnt, there's always opportunity, I think, to revisit sites partway through and towards the end of a development, and then possibly attend one of the local area team meetings and talk to members about a particular site, mindful that some of them can take quite some time to go from start to finish. So I'm always happy to talk to the chairs and the committees about how best that may aid them with future decisions and discussions around major developments. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. I think that would certainly help. They would address what I think those recommendations we're getting at from my perspective. They've been seconded. It sounds like they're viable to deliver. Could all those in favour of just pushing those recommendations onto Cabinet, just so that they're noted and on record, please unmute and signal your assent.
Agree.
Yes, agreed.
Yes.
Super. They sound like they're agreed. Andy and Phil, thank you very much for presenting that report and providing us with those quarterly reports and coming along to answer our questions. And just to reiterate that I think that sounds like good positive news, and thank you for your efforts in engaging with us. That leaves me only to thank councillors for coming. That concludes our meeting. And thank you to everyone who's watching us at home. The next meeting will be the 11th of March at 6:45 p.m. and that will almost definitely be here on Teams as well. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye.